be, but it's lovely to be with you today. I'm so grateful to Fika and Nukinko for collaborating and making this happen. My name is Jennie Fronczak, and I'm with the Chicago Community Land Trust. And I suppose why I'm here today is initially when I was born, my mom was not in a place where she could care for me, and I was subsequently institutionalized. And it's so clear to me that this is not what our society needs to be doing with children. And so the early portion of my career focused really on supporting children with a similar background. I noticed how we do so much to help children, but what are we doing to help families? How are we supporting parents to keep families together? And there's, as you all know, a huge continuum from healthcare to education, transportation, healthy food, all of the things. And where I'm at, because we have institutionalized racism and so many other things, there's intense segregation, and where one grows up, where one lives, particularly in their formative years, is the primary determinant of all of their outcomes in life, from health and wellness to education, job attainment, all of the things. And so for me, it was so apparent that housing in particular, it was critical to keeping families together, right? So we can support parents as well as children. And when I looked at why it was so hard for people to even find an apartment, much less, own their own home because of capitalism and all the things, I knew that we had to find a different way of doing it. And so in my prior capacity, I had been anchoring a local initiative focused on collective land ownership, which had been done, since the 50s, around here at least. But when we came up against government, when we approached the government for support on this initiative, there was a lot of, confusion and questions and fear on their part. So I was, able to anchor our neighborhood-based institutions and keep them at the table through the whole process, and essentially convince the municipality as well as our leaders at the state level to that this is viable and they should support us. And then I was invited by the municipality to oversee these programs for the whole city. So that's a little bit about me and the work that I do. So we use a shared equity model to expand access to homeownership and make it possible for folks who face lots of barriers otherwise to purchasing their own home and remaining rooted in the communities, especially those that are facing a lot of displacement pressure. So I'm very curious to know what informs your work, how you're developing new land ownership models. And I would invite you to take a quick minute to contextualize yourself and your work before we dive into the main discussion today. So I'm going to take the word and pass it to Mariola.
Hi, saludos to everyone. My name is Mariola Reyes Cruz. I'm here from the island territory of Puerto Rico. It's a U.S. territory and an archipelago in the Caribbean. I come to this work as a community psychologist by training, and also as a social justice and climate justice activist who has also been documenting for a long time the agroecological movement in Puerto Rico. And one of the issues that have come up over and over again is the struggle to secure secure access to the land that is just and equitable and sustainable. And to make the long story short, we built the first community land trust focused on agricultural land in Puerto Rico. We say national because we believe Puerto Rico is a nation. So it's a national effort in terms of the archipelago. And we are just beginning. this is the child of many long conversations for many years among people in different movements, and the experiences of the last two hurricanes propelled some of us to make it a reality. We needed an institution that would protect the agricultural land as a commons for the long term, and makes sure that people who cultivate the land, taking care of the land and people, have fair and equitable access to the land and security in their tenure. So that's where I'm coming from in a nutshell. And I, yes, Renato.
Oh, I think you're on mute, Renato.
Sorry, I'm Renato Simbalista. I am based in São Paulo, Brazil. I am a professor of the School of Architecture and Urbanism of the University of São Paulo, and I'm also one of the directors of FICA. FICA is an organization that buys property and rents it at non-speculative prices. Maurizio Pioletti is also part of it, and last 2019, I said last year because everything happened before the pandemic, is last year. We met Jennie also in Chicago in a talk, and I'm very happy to be in this conversation. We have lots of things to talk about government, in spite we are a civil society organization. And then I give the word to Maurizio.
Good afternoon. So I'm Maurizio. I am Italian, but during my PhD in urban and regional development, I stayed a little in Brazil, where I met Renato, and I was involved in this fantastic experience of the FICA Fund. And I'm currently a supporter of the fund. And in particular, I'm focused on the relationship between land uses, land occupation, and shared uses with governance and public policies. So, of course, these experiences require a very strong bottom-up effort, but it could be interesting to understand how to create models that can be recognized also at the institutional level. I give the word to the next, or how is the discussion?
I'll take it from you. Thanks, Mauricio. Lovely to have a small glimpse into your world. Thank you so much for sharing. I think we'll dive in by talking a little bit about how you've been creative and flexible and are using alternative forms of land ownership in your world. Yeah. So I want to know more about what's going on the ground in Puerto Rico, especially.
Okay, so in Puerto Rico, for the last 100 years, we've seen agricultural land increasingly going into disuse, but at the same time, we see strong push to speculate around land, and what there are places is called land grabs. We're living that as we speak, in terms of corporations and other foreign individuals buying land to and housing in big stocks of housing to speculate, right? It's just another mechanism. Is how, when land and housing is thought as a commodity and not its common purpose, right? So we've lived through different cycles of that, but in recent decades we've also become aware of how fragile or our food security is, how important it is for us to have control of the land so that we can feed ourselves. And there is a growing agroecological movement in Puerto Rico. It's a beautiful movement in the sense that many people from different walks of lives in different stages of their lives are turning into farming as a way of not only supporting themselves and their families, but also changing the way they relate to each other and to the land. And one key aspect to that is having access to the land. And one of the things that we've seen in recent years, particularly because there are more eyes on this issue, not because it's a new problem, is that we face different governments. This is not a political party issue. It's a mentality that reigns in our governments that see land as an asset and change the use of the land to accommodate those kinds of interests. So even if we have different protections for land as agricultural land or protected land for its other ecological values, if you will, the dynamics of corruption and just the capitalist system just moves things so that there are changes in the use without communities being able to have a say. So in Puerto Rico, there are only 3 CLTs. The other 2, the first 2 are the result of communities movements to stop gentrification in the face of community development efforts, and to have a say in the process. This is the first one that looks at the land as a commons. And so it also implies to rethink our relationship to agricultural land. Mm-hmm. And that is also a process. Everybody from the left to the right still thinks about property as a key asset, right, to secure a dignified life. So the question that we try to ask is, how can we attend to our needs and desires, making sure that the next generations are also taken care of, particularly in front of the climate crisis. And that is directly tied to how we relate and take care of the land. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, we are based in São Paulo. Our organization is really small. It started from scratch in 2015. But I can say we have, since it's a creative organization, we have some things to share and also to tell the government. This is a very interesting experience. From the beginning on, local government was paying attention to us. We were almost nothing. Vika started as a bunch of people, middle-class people, professionals, and we wanted to do something with property. We started to collect some money, and in parallel, we started to formalize an organization, a non-profit. And once we had a non-profit, we made a bank account and started a crowdfunding and said, we want to buy property here. And if money allows, we want to buy the whole city. This is more or less how it started. And to our surprise, some people started to engage. And 2 of our founders, they bought an apartment for us so that we could we could prove our model. And in parallel, we started a crowdfunding. Nowadays, around 160 people donate every month. And we bought in 2021 a second apartment, and now maybe in 2022 we can buy our third apartment just with money that people are donating, which is super interesting for us because on one hand people were very skeptical that in Brazil people wanted to be donating. They said, well, this is not the USA, this is not the UK, people don't donate that much here in this country. And we said, okay, let's try. And well, people started donating, of course, in a much less amount than we like. This was one hand. A skepticism towards our ability to raise funding for this like long term. We always say we are not doing anything for next year. We are doing something for 100 years. And there was another skepticism, which is about, well, when people donate, people want to see what they are donating for. How many people am I feeding with this donation? And we understood that there are quite many people that feel very happy, and I am amongst them, uh, that want to donate for something which is long term. But on the other hand, we got skepticism by people that say, why are you promoting social housing? Why are you acquiring land? Aren't you doing what the government should do? This is so since especially our progressive planning cluster is very much like statist. There is some skepticism about it, and since the beginning on, we said it's cool if the government wants to have also social housing and land and do it for the best purpose. It's really great. We are for it, but we think civil society can do something, and we also think it's time that we stop pointing our fingers in the nose of the government and saying, do this and do this. We can do, of course, it's always important to demand, but with FICA, we understood a whole new way of making activism, which is not demanding or denouncing, but offering. We say, listen, local government, we have a functional organization. We have all the possible certificates. We are being audited. We are healthy, sustainable as an organization. If you want to do any kind of public policies with us, we are here for you. Either giving us one of the thousands of public buildings that are vacant or misused so that we take care of them. We can do it quite well. We know it's very difficult for you to do so that we understand also pains of the government. Or our government has also is also spending, like many other governments, millions of dollars with rental vouchers, and these rental vouchers, they just inflate the rental market. If they went to organization like ours, um, the blanket would go farther. And what's interesting for us is that government officials, they understand us, they are fond of us. Left-wing governments and right-wing governments, they understand, and they like that we exist, and they understand that we could cooperate. Problem in Brazil, and maybe I talk a little bit afterwards about it, is that government is so conservative. Officials are so afraid of innovating, of being sued, of being questioned, that there is not much room for a new social agent that is not that new in the world, because in the Netherlands or in the UK, there are housing associations or nonprofits for housing for decades or hundreds. But in Brazil, it's quite new what we are doing, and it's really difficult for them to adapt to us. So that since we started, which is not that long ago, it's 6 years ago, government is more or less in the same spot, saying, okay, you are nice, you are cool, we want to cooperate with you, but at the end of the day, we are doing the same stuff, which is mm, putting more gas in the fire of private property. I leave you here.
Please.
Well, I just wanted to comment that in Puerto Rico, we have over 50 years of experience in co-op housing for low-income families. And it's sort of one of the best kept secrets in Puerto Rico because if when you talk to anybody that doesn't have a direct experience with the co-op system, they don't know that the co-op housing exists. And unfortunately, in part of the narrative to build these co-ops was that it was a pathway for low income families to be property owners. So as we move to, we pay our collective mortgages now. These co-ops, not all of them, but most of them, are looking forward to becoming individual property owners co-ops, which it's great for the individual owners, but it actually stops the project in its tracks, because in order to access the co-op, you will have to actually buy an apartment rather than becoming a member of the co-op with a low contribution. So in El Fideicomiso Agrícola, we're thinking about how we could somehow rescue that model, right? And make sure that farmers also have access to housing near or on the farm. And also the other element to this that I think you guys have touched a little bit on is the participatory governance of the commons, right? And what kind of structures are in place for this. And one of the things that we think about and we're puzzling with is how can we establish those structures that don't mimic the kind of the corporate legal structures that exist and that bind the non-for-profit sector in a sense, at least in our experience in Puerto Rico. So yeah, in terms of our relationship with the government, we're still not there yet, but we also see how in a sense we're trying to do things that other that in the early process of industrial development in Puerto Rico was aimed at but failed dramatically. And so in a way we are trying to learn from those failures as well, and looking into sort of the problems that we're facing now in a different light.
So after discussing with Renato and many other friends these issues that you are also discussing now, when I was in Brazil and also in Cuba, I came back to Italy. That is a very old and traditional country, and I looked for the models that were already in force and that could be somehow useful or comparable with the solutions that in other more recent countries, let's say, people are searching, are analyzing in order to solve social problems. And I discovered that even if, unfortunately, in countries like Italy, the right to housing is no longer considered as a real important fundamental social rights, and migrants suffer a lot from this cultural change the fact that housing is no more a real social structural problem. In any case, we still have the possibility to build, to organize building cooperatives of dwellers. And this specific legal solution stems from the 60s, more or less, when the socialist culture was very influent in European countries, even when the Communist Party was not the main party at the government. And the model of the building cooperatives of dwellers has remained for decades and is still possible to use it. The problem is that it's an important experience to consider, but probably when social needs are large, and the problem is not just building new houses, but using and share existing spaces or refurbishing them to make them suitable for current needs. The model of the building cooperative of dwellers is not so comfortable because it's complicated in terms of legal arrangement, because in any case, a cooperative is an economic actor. So what I observe is that, unfortunately, in southern European countries, we have not solved this kind of problem, and this the need for social housing, for shared spaces, for housing purposes, are rather left to the market. But it's also true that now in countries like Italy and Spain, let's say, new wave is going on, and it's the so-called ethical finance, the fact of funding new cooperative ethical banks. So let's say it seems that here the effort was moved from the basic real need, for example, of having funds and having resources for creating new housing spaces, to the financial management that must be ethical, and being ethical also understand the social need of housing and invests, or in any case support housing, social housing experiences. I don't know if in some other countries they are creating these small banks to, let's say, gather money and invest in ethical funds, from which they invest in social projects. Have you ever heard about this experience in financial experiences?
We here in Brazil, in Fundo Fica, since 2020, we are in a new experience. Since we started, people have been donating money for us, and then already in our first year, some of our supporters or associates, they said, "What about investing? You go just so far if you with donated money, but I think it could be important if people could invest in your organization, and you could uh, give them some kind of return. Since housing is such a profitable asset, isn't it possible to carve out a model? And we invented a model of attending the population of tenement houses in downtown regions of São Paulo, which pay enormous amounts of money for rent and live in awful conditions. Some academic studies say that one house, which is called a cortiço or a tenement house, which is rented for low-income people, sublet, can give to its owner or to the slumlord around 2% of the value of the property every month. We said, okay, maybe we can find some good people, good-minded people that would want some like 4% a year returns in our in their money, and we buy such a house, and we buy such a house that is giving 20% in return, and with the rest of the money, we choose something. And we got a very good grant from an interesting initiative. It's called a Wealth Inequality Initiative. It's from a Swiss foundation, and since 2020, we are inventing this kind of financial mechanism. It's interesting, we had to adapt our language. At first, we were accelerated by a organization with startups, and we were talking in terms of the investors, and we not slowly, we had to realize quite quickly that we are very bad investment compared to people that are investing in this kind of startups, even in what they call impact investment in startups. If they want 10 or 15% a year of returns, we can offer just 4% a year, because otherwise the rent would go up. And then we had to do a very interesting adaptation of our language, which is not this is an investment. And also what happened last year in Brazil is that interest rates went up. So when we designed the project, it was reasonably bad investment, but when we launched it, it was really bad investment in comparison to other things that the market could offer. And it was a very interesting journey, because when we understood that we would never be a good investment, we understood that our language could be different, which is I want to put my money and make my money work for for the world I want to build. Exactly like the Banca Etica that Mauricio has just referred to, you put in the chat here. And we found quite a few people that we called investors, but they are allies that accept to have a very low return. And we bought a house and we rent for people. It was an empty house, it was not a tenement house. We rent for 3 families that were living formerly in the next block in an awful tenement house. They are paying less rent. House is in a very good condition, and our investors are will get theirs reasonable returns. And then we set up a language, which is, when you wake up, know where your money is waking up. When you're going lunch, you have to know who are you, who is your money lunching with. When you go to sleep, you have to know in which bed your money is sleeping. And with this kind of language, we can access quite a few people. It's an interesting journey.
That's a beautiful way of framing the narrative that surrounds, impact investing, as sometimes it's called here. And I wanted to touch a little bit on some of the ways that we've been able to build partnerships between government and community-driven or participatory governance models. I think it was, and Mauricio, as you mentioned, alternative funding models are certainly a huge part of that. I think it was really rooted in bringing a number of different stakeholders together, and like crowdsourcing or crowdfunding is a piece of that, to show that we have skin in the game. And then also reaching out to developers, people who are skilled in building homes, since ours was primarily focused on residential. And then also looking at, how the city was already working and kind of reframing their narrative, like you all did, Renato, around like, where's your money sleeping? And kind of showing the city, hey, it seems like these are your values and this is important to you. And here's a proven method of implementing this. Here's the team we're bringing to the table. We've gotten this far. Doesn't it make sense for you all to pilot something with us? So that's kind of how we got to where we are. And so the biggest hurdle, I think, was really getting the municipality to a place where they were willing, I was about to say comfortable, and I'm like, I don't think that's the word, but willing to kind of relinquish control to community groups. So people can determine, how they want to hold their land, how they want it to be used. And it's really been the most effective in communities facing high displacement pressure, usually because some kind of catalytic investment poured in. We upgraded the train line nearby, or built a huge commercial district or something. And then the folks, who have called that place home for so long were unable to, and those most impacted tend to be migrant populations, tend to be Black or Brown, or Indigenous. So, I think it's been really exciting too to be in a position of connecting, which is really the spirit of this whole forum, of connecting community groups, like in one area with community groups in another area. And what I had been seeing is often displacement, while it has the same impact, sometimes it has different causes. In certain parts of our city, again, are experiencing tremendous development, catalytic investment, while other portions, have been historically disinvested in intentionally because of systemic racism. So bringing together two unlikely allies and getting those neighborhoods, those groups to work together and to reframe the whole argument of like, oh, disinvestment versus overinvestment, gentrification, into like displacement, like one umbrella term. And I think once we were able to really build relationships across the city and come together, as two groups, which typically the city engages very separately with very different tools in very different ways. But to have those two forces come together and present like a unified front saying, this is the problems we're experiencing. We have a solution. It's been proven here, there, and in other places. This is how we'd like to implement it here. At that point, like the city, like there was really not much they could say other than how can we support you? So that's kind of how we got government on our side. And then the next thing I'd say, if you're having a really hard time, get one of your people into government. Make somebody from your team one of those key decision makers, and it's a lot smoother after that. Pass the word back.
If I understood correctly, the proposal is to involve someone from these experiences in the local governments, and I really think it's the best way to proceed, because I observed here in Italy that since it's possible to present for the local elections, local political elections, so for municipalities in particular, so-called civic lists of candidates that are citizens who are not already part of any political parties. It's possible to build lists of bottom-up lists of citizens who become candidate, and if among those citizens there are not just active citizens, but sometimes there are also people really engaged in this kind of projects, then it's possible to enter the local government. Of course, it's not easy to be the first list of candidates, but maybe you enter in the majority, and you can influence the main political party in order to create suitable conditions, at least to make easier to realize these experiences. Because I also think that a very important aspect to be always taken into consideration is that these bottom-up social experiences have no longer a very strong a very strong political positioning. I referred to the 60s, where those experiences were more often related to a certain political sides, but at that time the world was really divided. Today, I think politics is much more flexible, and we can see the active citizenship as a very powerful modality to afford.
I think I don't know, at least in my experience, I think one of the realizations or the lessons learned in the last couple of years or decades is that no one organization nor one candidate nor one party can do everything that needs to be done at the level that it needs to be done. I mean, part of it is for us is to recognize that we're dealing with entrenched systemic issues that require systemic approaches as well. So one thing that we are attempting to do is to find ways to collaborate in what people are calling ecology of organizations, so that we can move forward while we're doing different things at the same time that could have a major impact in the systems that we're trying to nudge, right? Or, if you want to be more optimistic, transform. And but that is in itself is a challenge, right? Because there are many logics that operate, particularly in the third sector, how we, that the non-governmental civil society organizations. And so I totally hear what you guys are saying. I just I think I'm more optimistic about the possibilities of trying to articulate a process and also a narrative with other organizations that move a system, because we definitely cannot do everything from our organization, and and there are many people doing many important things. So it's part of the challenge. And the other aspect of this is that even with allies in the political system, they are dealing with multiple issues at the same time. So and there are multiple factors at that end as well. So it's not a clear cut cause and effect kind of relationship. It's multivariate, if you will. So another thing that I think is fundamental in these processes, though, it is public accountability. So at some point, when things don't move, people need to make it known and make it public that it's not moving, and why it's not moving, and where we want things to go. And that is something that has partially worked for social movements in Puerto Rico. And I say partially because people tend to think that with one successful action there is transformation, and that's not really how things work historically. But we move the needle, right? And that's one way of thinking about it. The other pressure, at least from my point of view, is the pressure of the climate crisis, which in a sense, I relate to what Mauricio is saying in terms of what what takes more time, and what is more difficult when you have the climate crisis as part of what you're trying to acknowledge and have some kind of an impact in how we're going to face this crisis in more solidarity and justice. Then the ways in which we traditionally work on social issues, I think, needs to shift, because we cannot negotiate with nature, and it's not going to accommodate itself to the rhythms of community organizing or government change. So it might not be clear cut when we think about housing in a particular region, but when you linked that to migration, when you link that to food security, when you link that to the changes in the climate that push locals out of where they are, then we need to have these conversations at a different kind of level and level of commitment, I think, and level even willingness to experiment with other ways of organizing ourselves and moving forward. I don't think there's a lot of time for that. So that pressure is very present for us.
What I feel about government officials is that in Brazil, at least, they don't make things not because they are bad or conservative or don't want to change reality. My perception is that their notion, their sense of risk is so much enlarged compared to the sense of risk that a normal person has in anything. In Brazil, in our juridical order, it's more or less like this: if you are if you are a citizen, if something that you want to do is not forbidden, you can do. In the government, you just can do something if you are expressly authorized to do that. And this makes a government official a whole different person than a normal person that you would see in the streets, that is much more afraid of taking initiative, of taking risks and so on. And I think in our society, in this such an uncertain society, if the government doesn't start to understand that his role is also to take some risks it will be increasingly difficult for him to respond to our ambitions. But for that, at least in Brazil, a whole regulatory change has to be done, because it's not that the government officials don't want to take risks, it's that if they take risks and something goes wrong, they are personally responsible for that. And they can even lose their house and money and being sued for something that is considered to be wrong, and they are sure that their boss will not take responsibility upon something that they have assigned, so that it's a whole chain of decisions based upon the idea that the government cannot take risks. And this damages us very much, because if there is a certain amount of risk that the society has to take, all the burden of the risk is going upon civil society, and none of them upon the government. And this is complicated. But maybe Jennie, who changed sides from the civil society to the government, has something to do about it. Was it difficult for you, this change of position in which you cannot respond as quickly as you could when you were like working in a civic organization?
I would say I don't interpret it as having changed sides. I feel like that contributes to the polarity. I see myself as building a bridge. And I think a part of it is helping government see that, everything isn't black and white. And instead of creating that list of all the things that could go wrong, like we ask the question, what could go right? Like what could go right? And reframing it from like, we need to roll out with like the perfect solution on day one, and instead switching to like an iterative model with a limited pot of funding, understanding this moment will be a pilot. Here's, we've done the research, everything is data driven, and there's, oftentimes like a precedent, if you will. And it's like, okay, and how do we contextualize that, for the specific issues we're seeing across our city and different markets and different communities, and creating space to be like, we're going to make mistakes. Like I let people know, like this will not be like a perfect, everything is not going to work out perfectly on round one. And we're going to learn from it, and then coming back with the learning, saying, this is what we learned, this is what we accomplished, let's celebrate what went well. And we knew up front some things were going to go less than well. This is what happened. This is how we pivoted. This is how we iterated on that to make round two so much more effective. So I think it's and it's real, but my experience being on the other side, Renato, is like so some of the same officials I used to stand in front of a microphone and breathe fire at are now, the people who put me in this position. And I've seen, a whole nother human side to them. And they're critically aware of, what could go right. And also they're like the front line for all of the public scrutiny, all of the, blowback. And I just feel a tremendous amount of fear sometimes. And so creating space where like, it's okay to be scared. It's okay to acknowledge that everything might not go right. And keeping just transparent, open lines of communication with our community partners on the ground, and letting them know this is how the decisions are made, and including them in that decision-making process. And instead of like government officials making the hard decisions, it's bringing our community partners with us and saying, all right, like these are the options. None of them are perfect. What set of consequences would you prefer, given that none of them are, and like allowing folks to be a part of that really hard decision-making process. It still doesn't generate perfect outcomes, but I find that it definitely builds relationships between, community groups that have been on the receiving end of horrific government policies for generations, hundreds of years, right? To to understand a little bit some of the challenges that the government officials face. And it's slowly teaching government officials that, like, you don't have to operate in a silo. It's not your job to sit on your pedestal of power and make all the choices. There are very well-equipped people on the front lines that are living this every day that will be most impacted by whatever choice you make. And it's imperative that you bring them into this decision-making chamber to be with you in this thought process, and as well as like driving the outcome. And like that doesn't yield a perfect outcome, but it brings the team together to the table so that every single round gets a little bit better, and we're collectively building this world that works for everyone. Yes, complete agreement. More love all around. So this has been such a treasure for me to get a little mini snapshot of what's happening in other places, and I'm so inspired by each of you. And I think our time is about winding down. So if anyone else, has a nugget they'd like to share, something maybe that they're looking forward to bringing into their own practice or projects, feel free to share now before we close out.
Thank you for the conversation. I feel energized. I feel nurtured, and every time I get into this kind of conversation about our institutions and also about government, I have the feeling that time runs different for institutions and especially for government. We don't have to think in terms of years, but in terms of decades. And in this sense, maybe we can be optimists that in 10 or 20 years' time, government will have the proper public policies that pay attention to organizations such as ours that are quite new in many senses, so that we have to give government time to adapt as well. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
So to conclude, thinking about the last reflection by Maria Olga, I would like to leave a key word, let's say, the relevance in any actions we carried out of the ethical and the critical consumption, because without these keywords, that is also a framework, we can connect all the problems that Maria Olga was mentioning, from climate change to food security, housing, and so on. Thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to hear different experiences, and it's great to have these windows, right, into how other people are struggling with similar processes and issues, and I take away from this conversation quite a few pieces that will help us in our conversations here. So thanks for the opportunity.
Well, thank you all so much for allowing me to walk in your world for a few minutes today. And I look forward to staying in touch and hearing how the project develops. I hope your third home works out very soon, Renato. And I look forward to hearing more from Mauricio and Maria Olga. Again, I want to thank Fika and New Inco for coordinating these conversations. And I look forward to many more years to come. Hopefully can reconnect with the rest of the teams and see where this leads. And with that, I think it's about time to sign off. Be well.